In the last few months, I've noticed a certain theme to videos about Canada. Why Canada will collapse in the next 10 years. Why Canada is collapsing. Canada is dying, leave before it's too late. Australia is next. So, should Canadians be preparing for an imminent apocalypse and stockpiling maple syrup? I've reviewed the 12 top Canada is collapsing videos, and I think it's time to add a pinch of reality to this whole topic. So after reviewing all of the videos, many of them do bring up good points about actual problems with Canada right now. There is indeed a housing shortage that is leading to sky-high rents and home prices and making life very unaffordable for many, especially young people. There has been a huge surge of immigration in the last 3 years, over 3 million new people, well past the ability of the housing market to absorb this number. There has also been a chronic underinvestment by the corporations into their employees' productivity, which has led to slow GDP per capita growth and even slower growth in wages. But none of these necessarily mean that the collapse is imminent. Instead, for the collapse to occur, we need something that would specifically deal a fatal blow. And among the videos that do provide this, the cause of death could be summed up by one of these three overlapping categories. Either high immigration will lead to the collapse, or the housing market will somehow lead to the collapse, or failing institutions and disaffected young men will lead to the social upheaval and collapse. So, let's review all of these and see if there is actually evidence to back them up. First, the immigration scenario. It goes kind of like this. High immigration in Canada is causing more strain on the healthcare system, leading to its eventual collapse. Adds too many new workers, leading to rise in unemployment, makes housing shortage worse, and creates more cultural conflicts, either because the new arrivals import cultural disagreements from their homes, or because of cultural conflicts between the new arrivals and existing Canadians. And all of this leads to rising crime, disorder, and eventual collapse of the society. So, what does the data actually say? In healthcare, the Canadian Institute for Health Information has been collecting all sorts of statistics on where the expenses are going. And when we break them down by who uses healthcare the most, it turns out that it's actually the seniors, with expenses going up a lot with each age bracket. In fact, in 2022, almost half of the healthcare expenses have been spent on seniors, when they were only about a fifth of the population. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. It's awesome to have everybody living longer. But it's important to note that most of the immigrants, both temporary and permanent, are actually in the age brackets that use healthcare the least. And, in fact, with some immigration streams bringing in additional healthcare workers, the immigrants start to look more like net contributors to healthcare system rather than net consumers. So it seems unlikely that immigration will lead to collapse in healthcare. In fact, it's one of the ways to keep it working well as the population ages. Okay, what about unemployment? Here, things are a bit more ambiguous. There's definitely been cases of international students lining up to get the few available minimum wage jobs in the area, and the unemployment rate has been picking up. But at the same time, Canada has been in an economic slowdown because the Bank of Canada has raised interest rates to cool the inflation. And if we compare the unemployment with the past recessions and slowdowns in 2015, 2009, and early 2000s, the unemployment rate is still lower than what it was then. And in fact, only less than 3 years ago, the unemployment rate hit a record low for Canada at 4.8%. And if the economy picks up, we could be there again with businesses complaining that nobody wants to work. So on the whole, it looks like immigration has at most only a moderate impact on unemployment. What about housing? This is where these videos actually have a point. Looking at the projection of housing units needed versus housing units available from the Parliamentary Budget Office, we see that one of the reasons why Canada is not catching up on housing is because of the steady population increases, mostly because of immigration, and tweaking the immigration targets downward for a bit would certainly help. But a bigger reason why Canada doesn't have enough housing is because it hasn't been able to build enough, because of a number of reasons, like slow approval processes, falling housing investment, and, important here, not enough construction workers to actually build the needed housing. And one of the answers to this is actually immigration, refocusing the immigration streams to admit more skilled trades workers. And finally, on the cultural conflicts, although there have been worrying headlines, I haven't been able to find good recent statistics to decide one way or the other. But in any case, we are not seeing the kind of rise in crime that would support a major countrywide clash of cultures or an imminent collapse of the society. Yes, the crime rates have been creeping up since the early 2010s, but they're still close to their all-time lows, and I don't recall Canada being close to a collapse in the 1980s or 90s. So it seems unlikely that immigration will cause any collapse. In fact, when used right and in the right quantities, it can actually help us get out of some of the problems that Canada is experiencing now. What about the second scenario, an economic collapse through the housing market? This scenario goes roughly like this. Because of the rise in house prices, investment into housing has become a huge part of Canadian economy. And the fall in house prices in the near future, maybe because of the rise in unemployment or because there is a housing bubble, will lead to an economic collapse. Now this time I won't nitpick the individual steps in the chain and I'll go straight to its conclusion. Can a fall in house prices collapse the economy? Fortunately, we have plenty of examples of house price declines in the last 40 years. Greece, Spain, UK, United States and many other countries following the Great Recession, Japan in 1990, and even Canada in the early 90s. And yeah, in all cases there was economic hardship for a while, but in no case has there ever been a full collapse of the economy or society unless there were other serious underlying problems. So although a housing bubble popping could make an existing crisis worse, it seems unlikely to cause a collapse all by itself. Which leads us to the third scenario, general societal collapse driven primarily by disaffected young men and collapse of the country's institutions. Typical examples provided in the videos were, again, healthcare, as well as loss of trust in the federal and provincial governments. This then leads to more unrest, which leads to some sort of breakdown of order or financial collapse. And once again, data throws some cold water on this scenario. Yes, there are more young men than women right now, and the rate of unemployment among them is high, at 12.8% and rising. But again, this unemployment rate is still well below the highs experienced in past recessions, and that's before the temporary resident population is set to decline because of the coming immigration cuts. Going back to this chain of events, we have already touched on the healthcare, and for the trust in the public institutions, the surveys that I've seen actually show higher trust now compared to a decade or two ago. And in any case, as we saw before, the crime rates don't support the idea that there is a big rise in public disorder, suggesting that this whole scenario is also unlikely to play out anytime soon. And finally, stepping back, while there have been plenty of bad news in Canada, let's also keep an eye on the good news. Canada is still the second highest educated country in the G20, the health outcomes are still close to the top of the pack and are getting better, and the wages have been creeping up, even after adjusting for inflation, though they have been doing it way too slowly. That said, again, there are real serious problems that still need to be solved. Canada still needs to build millions of housing units, it still needs to set the right immigration targets and deal with the fraud and all the backlogs in the immigration system, and it still needs to figure out how to get the companies to invest their cash into worker productivity. And if you are a Canadian citizen trying to decide which party to support, I'd strongly suggest carefully reading their policies and listening to their leaders. Of course, I am biased towards Canada's newest federal party, the Canadian Future Party, a centrist pragmatic party that focuses more on evidence and less on political ideology, but you should make the decision on your own. And in either case, if these problems aren't solved, I'm afraid it still won't cause a collapse, just a more boring scenario where Canada's economy continues to lag behind its peers.